My paper is called Educational Inequality in Australian Schools, Gonski and Beyond. As most people will know, in Australia anyway, that the term Gonski refers to a particular funding model that applies to Australian schools in general, whereby most are guaranteed a certain level of funding, but those schools that cater for the most disadvantaged students of various ilks are provided with additional sources of funding. Now, this Gonski model of funding was introduced 4 years ago and in various states and in various manifestations. And but the most significant amounts of funding arising from it will flow through, are supposed to flow through into these 15 and 16. Now, in Australia at the moment, we are in an election year. The Labor Party has promised to fund these additional final 2 years, 17 and 18, of the Gonski model, and this is particularly significant because this is the time at which the most amount of money will flow into the system. The Liberal Party as yet hasn't stated what it will do, but at the moment it's believed that it's unlikely to provide this funding. The debates around Gonski are significant because they speak to many issues which include Australia's position in the international system and questions of quality and equity and the links between the two, Commonwealth-state relations, authority, accountability and funding, private versus state schools and funding questions there, and finally educational inequality in the Australian system as a whole and its links to differential achievement. Now, my paper is in very broad sympathy with Gonski for two reasons. Firstly, because Gonski is the best thing that we actually have on the table at the moment, that is anyway likely to begin to address questions of educational inequality. And the second thing is because it makes extremely clear through unequivocal data that the government system educates a disproportionate number of disadvantaged students and therefore is particularly deserving of this additional funding. Now, I also, however, in the paper draw out some of the analytical limitations of the Gonski Report and therefore the funding that has flown from it. And I argue that one of the reasons for this limitation is because the report focused primarily on educational disadvantage and the ways in which it's compounded. And I argue that instead what it could have done much better is focused on the ways on that, yes, but equally on the way in which educational advantage and disadvantage are mutually constituted. In other words, how the benefits of some particular schools will be at the disadvantage of others. Now, I identify various, often quite subtle ways in which this particular mutual constitution happens, and I also point to some of the ways in which policy think tanks and international governments, or a couple anyway, have thought about addressing this question of mutual constitution. But I see that as a big problem with the Gonski analysis. The other thing I do is look at the links between spatiality and inequality, and the ways I focus particularly on what I call educational ghettoisation, not just of people who are disadvantaged and who live in poorer communities, but also the ghettoisation of the wealthy and wealthy schools. And I take an example in the paper of one particular location where this ghettoisation happens even when schools are very, very close to each other. And I show how what this means in terms of social segregation, restricted social mixing, and also in terms of the compounding of educational advantage, not just the compounding of educational disadvantage. Broadly, what I argue in the paper and what I try to offer is what I've called a systemic relational analysis of educational inequality in a particular country, and it's a model I think has applicability elsewhere. But I also point to the importance of looking at the links between space and educational inequality, and a number of the issues that arise when educational spaces are so sternly and firmly ghettoised.